Going to get started this evening. And what we're going to do this evening is learn a little bit about the Native American community. And but before we do that, I'd like to thank Lynn and David and Deanna for providing wonderful meal again. Very appreciative, and Walt has a announcement in the back that there are still FFH slots open for next week. It's next week, right? Next week, if anybody is interested in volunteering, there are still slots. Talk to Walt. Oh, talk to Dana. Yeah. Talk to the boss, whatever. They can get you. Tell you where the holes are and what you can all do. So with all that announcement, I want to introduce you. It's to Krystal Langholz, and she is a friend of Miriam who has worked with Native American populations, I guess most of her career. And so she's going to tell us a little bit about that, answer questions, and we're going to go from there.
Thank you so much for having me. As I'm introduced, my name is Krystal Langholz. It's still Krystal, but and I've been here for columns for many years, but I also refer to the faith and practice. I go to Council Tree Covenant Church in Harmony. So as I get to speak with you tonight, I'll be talking about work with Native American communities, but also know that I'm speaking to a sister of Christ. And so some of the issues and challenges that I'll be sharing are from that context. Okay, so I did need to sort of start with general history around Native American communities. For those of you who are more familiar with some of this, that might feel like, oh, I've heard that, or I know that. So forgive me for some of that context setting, but really needed to couch our conversation about Native Americans in Colorado in the broader context of Native American experience and history. So the first thing, just to sort of contextualize, right, is that first contact with Native communities happened earlier for Native American communities. 1513 in Florida, Ponce de Leon and their crew was the first to sort of establish contact with Native communities there. And that started a forced push out of all of the Native communities on the East Coast slowly over time to the West Coast. And I'll show you a visual of that here in a bit. And following after that, in 1741, the Alaska Natives made contact with Russians. And then Native Hawaiians were actually the last to have contact with European settlers in 1778. So that contact was with James Cook. And I do know many Native Hawaiian elders that have made the joke that they learned from the experience of the indigenous communities that came before them. And so James Cook made a very fast, untimely demise of the Native Hawaiians. But it really is, I will say that in general, the Native Hawaiians did learn a lot from sort of the hearing about colonization in other indigenous communities as their monarchy did a lot to really support and establish Native Hawaiian communities in a unique way because they had the benefit of sort of seeing what happened in other indigenous communities. So those are sort of the general timelines for first contact with Native communities. So I wanted to provide some support around thinking through government policy. Does it work? Oh, it's working. My flash is working. Where you can see what is happening to Native American lands from sort of the beginning of that colonization process and sort of how it's shrinking. As of right now, there's 570 certified federal tribes across the U.S., but they have very, very small land base, right? And that happened through a series of treaties and a slow process of government policy, stripping Native people of their lands. The government process around this, so one thing that's very unique about Native communities is that those reservation communities that eventually we'll see when it gets to the little tiny specks that are still left are considered separate sovereign nations by our federal government, which is to say they were entered into treaties as if they were their own countries with their own nationhood and government. And so Native people have different kinds of treaty rights underneath the federal government and different kinds of protections underneath the federal government because of many of those treaties. So one of the concepts that's really popular and talked about a lot in Native communities is this concept of sovereignty, which is that governmental process of self-governance. So the reservations that are within the states themselves are supposed to they're not subject to state laws in the same way. They're supposed to be only subject to federal laws. So sometimes you'll see, for example, in states where there's anti-gambling laws, and we'd be like, I don't understand, why do they get to have a casino? It's legal here. That's because that would be something that would be governed on the state level, which the tribes are not subject to those state laws. So that's kind of the general concept there of sovereignty. So a couple really important government policy things to talk about. In 1887, one of the things that happens is called the Allotment Act. And what they try to do with the remaining native lands, of which you can see are very, they're getting smaller here. They try to basically say, okay, you can function just like European settlers. We're going to give everybody 100 acres and a plow, and we expect you to, farm land and live just like Europeans. And as such, they pulled some of the lands under sort of the broader trust system of having it belong to the tribe, and they allotted it to individuals. So there was a lot of issues that happened when people weren't able to make weren't able to make tax payments. They weren't able to make a living on that land. A lot of that land was lost underneath the Dawes Act and sold to white farmers and settlers. So one of the things you see when you see that map of remaining reservation land, even within those reservation lands, you might have land that isn't owned by the tribe, but is instead owned by non-native people that were gifted that land through the Allotment Act. So another important, and there are so many government policies to talk about. I just really had to crystallize it to a couple of big points. And as I'm talking about them, I know some of them are a little bit maybe you've heard them, maybe you haven't. So don't hesitate to ask questions. I'm happy to stop and answer questions that you might have. But the next government policy that I want to make sure to contextualize is what's called the Indian Reorganization Act. And so in 1934, what happens is they say, okay, if you're going to be separate sovereign nations, you need to function like our governments. And we're going to tell you what that government should look like. So they gave the tribes constitutions, like draft constitutions, but they didn't really they didn't think about it as well as sort of what we know is important in good governance, right? So they gave everyone 2-year terms that sits on a tribal government for those, and at the 10 of those 2-year terms, all the tribal government people would turn over, right? So the tribal council would completely turn over. So, and now those were the constitutions of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which oversees Native American policy. Sort of held to all the tribes in the act at the time. And many tribes have gone on to revise those constitutions, but many of them, because they require every single member of the tribe to change the constitution, still have those really terrible constitutions from 1934. So this makes economic development in Indian country very, very hard, right? Because the governance, right? You can't do economic development. You can't really invest in your community if you don't have stable governance, right? If you don't have, in our system, right, we've got a Senate that turns over at a different pace than the House of Representatives. You have this sort of stability in government. And that is generally lacking in many Native communities because of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. So the last policy that we want to talk about is what's called termination. And this happened in 1953, where the federal government looked at all the tribes and said, hey, like this isn't going so well for you guys. Like you're not, like everybody's in poverty, like this isn't working for you. So if you want to, you can terminate your tribe and we'll give you money for it. And we will help your tribal citizens resettle to urban populations. So one of those population centers that people were helped to resettle in for tribes that chose to go through the path of termination is Denver. So I'm going to talk about sort of what's happening in Denver and the Native nonprofits that are around Denver. But there is a really strong sort of Native American urban population and presence directly related to that termination policy of 1953. Any questions about governmental policy? 5-minute version of governmental policy. This is a lot, right? It's a lot. Okay. You're doing better with the clicking, so I'll let you. Okay. Oh, I have to click it and it'll change. Okay. Okay. So I also would be remiss if I talked about the sort of governmental pressures and processes, but I also wanted to put that in the context of sort of Native culture and directly how that relates to Christianity. Because I think it's really important that we sort of, as Christians, that we understand that history. So first of all, it's important to know that it was deemed illegal to practice Native American religion and culture. This ultimately leads to what's called the Wounded Knee Massacre that happens in the Pine Ridge Reservation, where people are slaughtered for practicing what's called the ghost dance at that time, which was a spiritual practice and sort of it had those political undertones in it, right? It was about cultural revitalization, but a pretty deeply spiritual practice. And so religious practices of Native people were deemed illegal by the US government. And Christianity was very complicit in sort of the forcing Native communities and encouraging Native communities to give up their culture. So in 1892, that's where this quote comes, is kill the Indian, save the man. So well-meaning Christians throughout seeing what was happening, right, to Native populations, seeing the forced reservation system, seeing sort of massacres that were happening from the federal government, come up with this the idea is like, well, as long as Native people are just like the settlers and they practice the exact same cultural practices and they become Christians, then like they don't have to live on the reservations, right? They don't have to. We'll be helping them by helping them terminate the culture. So there's a system of boarding schools that are established across the U.S. Largely, the federal government creates them, but they're subcontracted up to Catholic, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, well-meaning people that are running these boarding schools, where the purpose really is to sort of kill the Indian, right? People, their hair are cut for people that come. They are forbidden from speaking their language. They're taught Christianity. They're separated from their families, starting at a very young age, and taught sort of how to live like an European. I've been doing Native American economic development for 15 years. And I can tell you that every single Native person that I've interacted with has had a family member or has had either their uncle, their grandfather, their auntie, still up into the 1950s, 1960s, were sent to these boarding schools. So the trauma that comes with that cannot be overstated. And sort of the experience that I've had working with those populations as a Christian, like I've held people while they were crying and sort of telling me about those experiences and sort of that trauma had been like for them. And of course they came out publicly last year that in Canada, that many of those boarding schools, they have found mass burial sites for Native children there. The US, shortly after the Canada report came out, did a sort of a review of sort of the practices here in the US and found actually 592, I think, sites of Native children on boarding school properties here in the US as well. So that was not isolated to Canada. So there's, as you think about sort of Christianity in Native communities, there is a lot of like hard feelings around that history that is something to be reckoned with and understood and dealt with compassion. Any questions about that? I'm just like really hitting you with hard stuff. Okay, so I've done this kind of full context setting, sort of, which was hopefully helpful to you, broader Native experience, but I want to kind of transition to talk a little bit about Colorado specifically. So Northern Colorado, Colorado itself, right, at the time, people lived all over the place, right? A lot of the folks on the plains were plains people, right? So they would follow buffalo herds. So Colorado had tons of indigenous populations over time that were coming in and out, right? And then you also have sort of the mix-up that was happening as sort of as tribes were being pushed out, as they were getting pushed further east, that you'd have more tribes, you know, that were making it out west here in Colorado too. So the three most sort of common population centers were Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne, but there were Lakota, there were Pueblo people, there were Navajo people. There was a lot of different kinds of indigenous people that were making life and way in and through in Colorado. So what I have up here right now, picture-wise, is a picture of sort of the remaining reservations that are around Colorado, because they're all part of sort of the broader history of what happened in Colorado history. But you can see in the big corner, I think there are two reservations down there. Those are Ute reservations. But those are the only two remaining reservations in the state. But many of the other population centers that were in Colorado got pushed to these other reservations that were around here. So the Northern Arapaho, which was largely who's here in Fort Collins, fares actually fairly well comparatively to some other populations. The settlers here in Colorado, nothing was great here. I mean, but I'm like, great is a scale, right? But the settlers in the Arapaho get along fairly well, and so they are permitted to sort of stay until Fort Collins, Camp Collins, I guess it was called, was terminated, at which point the Arapaho become desolate and have to move to other reservations. But they were not subject to some of the same, we'll talk about some of the other events that happened in Colorado. Those were largely happening to Southern Arapaho and Shoshone folks who were repopulated into the other reservations. So all that to say that the folks who were here in Fort Collins, well, like I said, there's a lot of population mixing, right? So I'm not sure. this is not, I'm not an expert in Colorado Native history by any stretch, but as far as sort of her cursory sort of research and experience tells me, they did not end up sort of in the sort of like the Sand Creek Massacre that many of their sort of southern partners end up in. So the southern Arapaho and the Shoshone end up at a small reservation near Sand Creek under in 1861, which is called the Treaty of Fort Wise. It's on the very like southeast part of the state. They live in that reservation community. You'll know it's not on the map anymore. It was one of those that was seeded that did not last very long, but was established there. And then in what happens shortly after sort of the establishment of that community is the governor of Colorado at the time basically says it's open season on Native people. And you're doing your civic duty if you are willing to kill Native Americans. And so that puts into motion what happens in 1864, which is the Sand Creek Massacre in that community, where volunteers go and massacre women and children in that area in southern eastern Colorado. It was around 150, I think, folks that are killed in that massacre. That actually has really pivotal part in sort of U.S. politics and history, because at this point that's there's public outcry around it. So it actually forces the government to stop some of these policies around, like governors can be like, yeah, it's open season, I need people, if you kill them, there's ramifications. It does actually sort of stir public opinion to stop some of that, which is great. But obviously, I know many folks that I know folks that are descendants of the folks that were in the Sand Creek Massacre. And it's still a very present memory for many Native people. So yeah, and then in 1867, Camp Collins closes, and the northern Arapaho that were here, that had stayed, that had not been forcibly relocated to the reservation, go to the Wind River Reservation, which is the one up from the top in Wyoming, which is a shared reservation, the Shoshone and Arapaho. And the Shoshone and Arapaho, the government did this a lot, where they were like, here's 500 square miles, and we're going to stick 6 tribes on it that have nothing along, and sometimes they were even mortal enemies. They're like, figure it out. So that's pretty common, but so there's a shared reservation, Shoshone Arapaho, in Wyoming, which is where most of the descendants who were living here at the time of contact with the settlers were relocated. So anything to sort of add there or questions? Ooh. Yeah. Okay. So in the sort of context, I don't want to talk about sort of Colorado today, but I wanted to sort of talk about the Americans today rather than give you some great history. But I gave you all that great history because you kind of understand what the Native experience is like now if you don't understand all that history, right? I have an Indigenous friend who likes to say that America was founded on the free land, free labor version of capitalism here. And so, and that has long-term ramifications of sort of what that means for folks as they continue to live in America today. So Native households have 8 cents of wealth for every dollar of wealth owned by white households in America. That is the lowest of any minority group in the US. And although there is significant structural racism with other minority populations in the US, such as African American communities, but Yeah, I mean, and that's a direct tie from the history of assets for Native peoples, right? The poverty rate is 25.4%, which is the highest in any demographic group in the country. So I began my professional career with Creek Reservation, which is in central South Dakota. I ran a Native American nonprofit there called Humpati Investments. We were a micro-lender and helped people start small businesses. But Buffalo County at the time where I was located and where I began my nonprofit was the poorest county in America and had been for generations, right? So these are counties in America, many of these reservations have been in persistent poverty since they were established, right? So there's this persistent poverty of these rural reservation communities that were put in places. My good friend, in her indigenous language, the word for reservation is actually leftovers. So these weren't generally like land masses that were designed to be sustainable. They were the leftovers after the settlers took all the good farming land and all the good everything. Right, so that's a challenge. All these challenges in sort of the rural reservation setting, which I'll talk a little bit about too. But you also these demographics are not much better for urban Indian population either. They also experience significantly higher levels of poverty as well. There are so many persistent challenges to economic development in Native communities. I can do a talk just about that, but I won't. But simple things. So if you want to get a loan from the bank to buy a house, what do you use as collateral? You would use your house, right? So you pay back your mortgage, someone will come and take your house. So because of the status of federal trust lands, it makes it very difficult for land to be put in collateral because the land has to continue to stay in the hands of the federal government. So this is a huge impediment to economic development in Indian country because people don't want to lend in Indian country. Banks don't want mortgages in Indian country. People don't want to have capital in Indian country because they're concerned about collateral. If you have weak government, if you want to start like a good economic development process, you're like, we're finally fixing 25, right? Like we all agree we gotta do it, right? If you have a new government that comes in 18 months, they're like, oh, we don't care about 25. Now we're gonna build a farm. So you have sort of these challenges with economic development in Native communities in these reservation contexts because of a lot of these continued structural barriers. Any questions about those? Okay. So modern Colorado, 54,000 folks, or 1% of Colorado population, that are highly immigrants. And as I saw in 1953, Denver was the voluntary metropolitan area of the BIA over Upland. So that means that there are a lot of those Native people are all over. So there's Dakota folks, there's Navajo, there's because they were resettled to Denver just from everywhere, not necessarily like our they chose that. That resettlement process was pretty painful. So a lot of people were like some jobs when they got here. They were going to get stipends, like to live. They were going to be like, so the idea was that they were going to be set up to be successful. The folks that elected to do this resettlement process. The BIA only provided support to those families for a very short period of time. So if they struggled, right, or let's say they lost a job, they were having difficulty sort of adapting to cultural expectations for work, whatever it was, right? They were not given what they were promised. leaving many of those urban centers to have the sort of same high poverty challenges that we see in other communities. That being said, there's a pretty thriving culture in Denver, Native Americans. We'll talk about some of those cool things. Okay. So one thing that Colorado has got great, and super cool, is there's a great infrastructure of Native American nonprofits here. And I'm really close to this because this was my infrastructure. So I, for 3 years, but was the chief operating officer at an organization left Vista, which is a Native community development financial institution intermediary. So we supported community-based microlenders that worked in Native communities around the U.S. There's NARF, which is Native American Rights Fund. So they're the folks that, like, if there is a issue with the federal government and no, you have not performed the treaty rights that you were supposed to perform, a lot of those tribes would go to Native American Rights Fund to do legal action against. In many cases, it's usually the federal government, but sometimes it's states, kind of mixed up a little bit. But so they do many legal battles. There's also First Nations Development Institute, which is the oldest Native American philanthropic organization in the country, Native serving. They're a really wonderful organization focused on Native culture and youth. They're really unique in that they're a Native-led organization. They have a Native board. Most of their staff are Native American. All 4 of these are Native-led organizations, which means that their staff are a lot of those folks from Denver, right? That I was telling you about, have ended up in these organizations. A couple of them are in Longmont, a couple of them are in Denver, but they're kind of scattered in that Denver metro area, taking advantage of sort of the Native American population as a workforce, but also Denver was the reason that First Nations Development Institute chose to locate here in Denver. They originally established in DC was because if you're going to work with tribes, do you want to be located in DC? There's not that many tribes out there, right? They've all been pushed apart. So if you're going to be regularly on site communities, Denver was a really attractive place to be located as a Native nonprofit because you have the urban center, the population center that was here. You have good airport, so you can get to various places around the U.S. Back in the day, housing was not so much anymore, but so there were these strong Native nonprofits that were established here. And then the American Indian College Fund, which does exactly what you think American Indian College Fund should do, provides scholarships to Native youth around the whole U.S. It's also located here in Denver. So yeah, some really great positive infrastructure here in the Denver area. I'm sorry that these are small. They're big on my screen. I don't know what that is, but one of the things I get asked is sort of, how do I stand in solidarity from where I am with Native communities? Like, right, maybe you don't have Native friends or no Native people. Like, how do I stand as a partner and pursue justice for Native communities? So I just wanted to give some things and themes that I've heard from my Native friends over the years and through my work in Native communities. So one thing that's really important is that speaking and teaching the truth about the Native experience. I can't tell you how many times I've been with people and I've just like dropped a random fact about something and people be like, I didn't know that, right? And it's because largely, right, I think my generation was okay, like we learned about the Trail of Tears, at least, but like nowhere near sort of the context of devastation that was really true about the Native experience Americans was communicated to me growing up. And I think that's still the case in many communities, right? So there's sort of a sacred obligation around sort of speaking and teaching that truth. I would also just say, advocating for apology. Our council, our denomination covenant recently did a repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, which is sort of the theological underpinnings that allowed a lot of the trauma with Native communities and allowed people to perceive that as sort of the right approach to dealing with Native populations. There's also need for, in Australia recently they did a apology to Aboriginal peoples, finally, but those things do actually matter, right? To sort of have to say, like, my truth matters, like my experience and my aunties and my parents, they matter. And so even if that you can't do reconciliation without that sort of acknowledgement of truth, right? So if there are spaces in your world where you get to be able to advocate for those things, like that is really helpful. If you have financial needs, you can give to Native-led organizations that serve Native kids. I named a bunch, and you're like, I think kids. I'm like, great, got an option for you. You're like, oh, microfinance, that's awesome. We got options for you. There's some great Native organizations that you could potentially give to. Let's think about that. Supporting Native artists. So up there right now, that logo is from an organization called 8th Gen. And their tagline is inspired natives, not inspired by natives, right? So if you think of like Pendleton and the beautiful quilts and all that stuff, so those are inspired by natives, but their work that they do is really by Native artists doing very similar things, right? So like making beautiful quilts, like beautiful throws, beautiful jewelry. So there's a lot of really great Native artists out there and Native small businesses that you can support. It's always fun at Christmas to like give somebody like, oh wow, I didn't even know this existed. So that's a way to stand in solidarity. I would also just share, like, I shared this very difficult history of Christianity and Native culture. But as you think about, church missions and the approach to church missions that your faith community is in, there's a need to sort of connect the dots and say, what kind of church mission work are we doing? What's the purpose of that? And are we being reflective about whether that is really in line with God's will for justice in the world? And is it maximizing sort of what is possible when Christians mobilize and come together to seek justice? And then I would also just say there's a really great need to learn more about the modern Native context. And I've given some fun for that. Like if you're like, yeah, I want to learn more. Like, I want to get a sense of this in our community. So CSU has a Native American Student Association. They have great events all the time. They have powwows. They have for Indigenous Peoples Day, which was Monday, like they have events. There's in November is Indigenous Peoples Month, so Native American Month. So they have events for Native American Peoples Month in November. So there are ways that you can. So I definitely would suggest like checking them. If you've never been to a powwow, they're super fun. There's usually like really good food and fun dancing, and like it's a really fun cultural event. And it's totally appropriate to be there as an outsider. Like sometimes you, I don't know what's happening here. I just show up. It's totally okay. There are sacred ceremonies in Native communities that it's not okay to be at. Like Sundance, like don't just stumble into a Sundance, guys. But it's okay. Some powwows that are in the community, and in fact, they usually even have dances that are called intertribals, where people can come and participate in dance if you're not of Native American ancestry. They're fun. So There's Indigenous Peoples Day events. I shared that. There's a Shining Film Festival that is, I think it's down on the reservation. So there's some fun film festivals around Indigenous people. And I was talking about powwows. Denver boasts one of the best powwows in the entire country. It's called Denver Market Powwow. As you can guess, it is in March. I know, shocking. But it is truly a spectacle. It is, there's all sorts of native artists that you can buy things from. There's beautiful events. It's definitely worth the trek down to go see. You know, you're willing to, if you want to go more with it, you're riding to Pine Ridge. Pine Ridge is only about 5 hours from here. Just in the South Dakota, going and visiting Wounded Knee, being in a reservation community, seeing that, experiencing it is really, can be a really powerful experience. It's not very touristy, like it's not a tourist destination. I mean, you got like some fun, like Rapid City is kind of touristy and stuff like that, but like, well, there's nothing touristy about Wounded Knee, but it can be a really powerful experience if you sort of let yourself get immersed in the history of that space. And then I would also just share that like there's a lot of really good Indigenous produced media. So there's a really fun series out called Reservation Dogs. And it's about some teenagers growing up on a reservation in Oklahoma. It's really funny. And it's actually, I mean, all of my native friends, all of my experience traveling on reservations would tell me that it's pretty accurate to sort of native life and culture. But it's kind of going to be a fun way to learn about native culture, watch something like that, and just making sure that and I would just encourage you as you sort of go through that and think about that, making sure that that media that you're consuming is from Indigenous peoples and telling their story, right? So that's one of the great things about Reservation Talks is it's produced by actual Native people. Whereas, right, you know, I love Dances with Wolves as much as the next girl, but that was not an Indigenously produced media, right? So, so yeah, and if you're like a social media person, right, you can follow some of those nonprofits I talked about, following some of those so you can sort of have a stronger media diet and sort of be exposed to the kinds of conversations and issues and things that are happening in Native communities. So those are all my slides. So I just would like to spend the rest of the time answering any questions that you might have.
Anybody have any questions?
Jim Thorpe was one of the most famous Indian football players in baseball. He was in one of the Pennsylvania reservation schools, and the head of that school was the one that came up with the Kill the Indians, Stay the Man. And he was actually in school about 13 years in Pennsylvania. And of course, one of probably the most famous football game that they played was at Army. And Eisenhower was the cadet at West Point, and the Indians had a chance to whip up on the Army. I don't know what the problem was, but they had multiple touchdowns. They said, yes. Boom.
Sure. Yeah, I can. So as I shared, through my career running what's called a community development financial institution. So we did consumer loans, like so people that they had bad credit, they could fix their credit. We did loans, so helping people that wanted to start small businesses, right? Because there wasn't access to banks. So So Pine Ridge, size of Connecticut. It did not have a bank until last, I think it's like 8 years ago. The Lakota people actually opened their credit on Pine Ridge. But you know, can you imagine that, right? Like, so that makes it really hard when people do things that don't have family members that have money to give them money to start small businesses. There's no way to sort of generationally get yourself out of poverty. So one of the answers to that, right, is to do micro loans, do small business loans. So an example of an organization that you probably heard of that does microfinancing, that would be called Kiva, right, where you're doing small loans to people, and that's done internationally, but it's also done here in the US too. So my organization did that, and then we also did what's a match savings program. So if somebody saved for their child to go to college, we'd be able to match them $1 for that, right? So those were strategies to build assets in communities that didn't have assets. So those organizations exist around the whole US. There's some that exist in Denver, and they serve, you know, people all across the state, right? So there aren't exclusively focused on. There's only 70 that are exclusively focused on Native communities here in the US. But there are thousands of what are called community development financial institutions that do that work in communities that otherwise wouldn't have access to capital. So WISTA, the organization that I got to work with for 10 years, they supported, they were a backbone organization for those Native American nonprofit organizations that were scattered across the US doing that kind of lending. Because no economic development solution is going to work if it's not holistic. So capital has to be part of that, right? People need to be able to start small money to start small businesses, fix their credit and buy homes. Yeah, and I recently transitioned to helpful further context. So I started at this very small community level, and I worked at WISTA, which was a national organization. And I just actually took a job with an organization called Calvert Impact Capital, which actually supports microfinance and other kinds of organizations. So after 15 years of sort of exclusively focusing on Native communities, I'm going to be working with communities across the globe, but still very much in that same vein focus.
I recently reconnected with a childhood friend who is Native artisan. The honor and the sled.
Oh yeah.
And ranging to purchase Christmas presents. But I had, you know, what was interesting was I asked him, well, where, because you're saying, okay, where could I purchase them? He said, no, please purchase from me. And you know, it got me thinking, you know, with a lot of artists, we have the SERVE program, a lot of Presbyterian churches participated, where artisans from all over the world can trade their goods, their crafts, and stuff like that. Is there something like that that exists for indigenous people?
I love that. So the answer is not really. If you were looking to connect with an individual or Native artist, there's a really great nonprofit organization in Rapid City called the First Peoples Fund that funds Native artists. And so they keep sort of a roster of indigenous artists that you can sort of look up and you know, try to connect with, which is useful. And then there are sort of individual communities that have developed their own. So there are some tribes that, you know, have like certified Cherokee, like they have a you know, some certification processes, because they're so often, you know, like if you go to a trading post or, you know, anything, like there's no way of knowing, like, did they get this from China, or did they get this from an actual artisan, right? So it's really hard to know. So there are some tribes that have certification programs to sort of authenticate that something is actually from the community. But in general, like there is not a national accrediting body that does that, and there's a huge need for it. But yeah, great question. Yeah, so it's called First People's Fund. Yeah.
And we donate all the time. We get Christmas cards, aprons, all kinds of gift bags. They send all kinds of things. I wonder how well they do with this type of program when they solicit. And do you know about this? Have you ever heard of this? Anyone else received? Things.
Like, I've even got mails in like native boarding schools, like soliciting me for money, and I was like, I think you found the wrong person here, like, so, it is, so, you know, I think the questions to sort of just be asking yourself as you're sort of evaluating, like, where can I give, how should I give? Is that yourself as a native led, so you can go look at the report and determine, like, are there actual native representation of the groups? Is there staff are here to reflect the community that they're in? And it's not to say that you shouldn't give to an organization that's not native led. I actually know some really amazing ministries that really do ministry really well and are not native led, right? So they're not trying to say that that's, but that is a good guidepost. Also making sure that they're an accredited 501c3, so that they're an accredited nonprofit is always good. But yeah, all that to say there are quite a few folks, and I don't know the specific organization, but those would be good things to sort of evaluate with to check to see if they're, you know, legit. And but it is, you know, there are lots of native organizations that do mailings like that. So First Nations Development Institute. So how a nonprofit does that, I've been in nonprofit management for a while, so I can tell you how we do this. How we do this is you can buy a list of people that you know, like, meet certain characteristics, right? So you could say, I'd like to buy a list of people that we know make over $70,000 that give to these kinds of charitable causes that you know, seem to vote this way, right? And be like, and then you get their address. You're like, hello, introducing myself. I am a great nonprofit organization. Don't you want to support me? And so that's part you can get. All that to say, you can get solicited in the mail from legitimate nonprofits that bought your name on a list for sort of meeting characteristics, being the kind of person that's going to be like, yeah, I'll support that. You can also like have non-legitimate people who are maybe like, I could have spent my money better, you know, kinds of organizations too that reach out to you, right? So you just kind of have to do some of that work to look at the organization and be like, is this, you know, is this the best use of my funds? Okay. Yeah. Then in your stuff. Yeah. Yeah. So most nonprofits I know give you options to like stuff like that. Like, so, you know, like you can buy this huge journal like with a donation of $50. Check here if you don't want it. You know, so there's usually those kinds of pieces. But yeah, a lot of, I mean, and that is, it's also hard to know too. Like if you do go to a Native community, like you will most likely be given gifts. Like gift giving is a huge part of Native culture and community. So it's hard to separate out some of those pieces sometimes. and like as somebody who ran the data, right, like we gave gifts all the time to our funders and people that supported us, but that was part of that sort of cultural component, sort of gift giving culture. So obviously there's a lot of things there, but I think if you don't like it, I want to. Question. Yeah, so what I think you're referencing is Dakota Access Pipeline. Is that what you're talking about, or the collections? Oh, just water, like basic necessities. Oh, yeah. So there are several. Back to your question about, I can talk about the Habitat for Humanity because I sat in the Habitat for Humanity Dakota TVs. There are quite a few Habitat for Humanity chapters that are located in Native communities. There's also a lot of Boys and Girls Clubs in America that are located in Native communities. So if you're like, I really want to go to an organization that I know is part of a bigger network that I know works on an issue I care about, there might be a national chapter of those located in a community, like in Native communities that you might want to look at getting into. I don't know an organization that specifically works on water. I'm sure there are. Most of the organizations I worked with and knew more intimately are those that are kind of less about relief and more about systematic change. So I bet there have to be some good sort of relief charities out there too that would do something like water.
I was just going to say that something that is not news that didn't get a lot of attention is the fact that for the first time in our country's history, we will be signing our currency money, and one of them is Chief Barbara, who is the first female chief of the Vegan tribe. This was appointed in June as the secretary. She was signing money from Jamila. And I know her piece was in my classroom, second grade. She came to our classroom.
Yeah, it's really exciting. There's been, not to be political, but there has been, I have so many Native friends that are now in Washington who were called to be part of the new administration to serve in roles in the new administration. It's been really exciting to see that. Right, so so there has been an example of a lot of higher people, that Native people in sort of positions that are public like that. It's really cool. Yeah. Yeah. Big, I mean, that was huge for Native communities. That was like, you know, because the Department of the Interior oversees what I talked about earlier, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So to have a Native person that's actually placed in charge of the department that oversees all of those lands and policies after so many years of these terrible government policies is a big deal for Native people. It was great cause for celebration.
I have a question about trans direction. Fears, self-identified. Would be the case that the second part is what people remember Native Americans who not
Yeah, so I'll tackle your first question first. These are great questions. So one thing that's important to know about sort of thinking about rural and urban native communities is that this tends to be very fluid, right? So you might have folks that they're from the Pine Ridge Reservation and they go and work in Rapid City during the summer, right? And you might have folks that maybe go and live off reservation. They go to Minneapolis for 2 years, and then like grandma gets sick and they come back home. So it's just very, all I say that those numbers, those populations are very transient. Like doing economic development was really hard because people's cell phones and phone numbers changed all the time. People were moving constantly because one of the things that happens is folks might go to their urban centers for work, right? The community I worked in was 78% unemployed. 78%. So like, if you want a job, you can't get it on the west, right? You're gonna have to drive, you're gonna have to go somewhere else, right? So people will leave, but then somebody gets sick, people want to live on their ancestral homelands, right? There's a lot of calls and people and culture, right? People can participate in their ceremonies, but there's a deep connection there too. So all that to say, the answer to your question is about 60% live in urban across the whole US, and 40% live on reservation. But those communities are not, they're constantly moving, they're constantly evolving, and they're deeply connected with each other.
Can you consider investing in music rights?
Yeah, there absolutely is. So one of the things that happened is, so when I told you about those constitutions that were put into place, and in those constitutions, what was established in them is called blood quantum. So it is basically saying, like, to be a federally enrolled citizen of a federally recognized tribe, you have to be a certain percentage of whatever that ancestry is, right? And so there are some tribes where that number is as high as 50%. So for Native Hawaiians to be considered Native Hawaiian, you have to be 50% Native Hawaiian, right? Like, that's a really high number, like the community in America where everybody's marrying everybody and everybody's having babies, like, right? And then in other places, like the Cherokee a while ago, we're like, all dying out. Like, these numbers are nuts. We don't want to do blood quantum this way. We can choose to change our constitution and say, hey, anybody that can claim ancestry can be part of our tribe. So they can choose to do that. But it's really difficult to make those changes in blood quantum because what happens is people, so sometimes there are tribal benefits that come out, right? There are tribes where that are wealthy, right? That have casinos maybe. And so they get what's called a per capita payment to their tribal citizens. And if you have more tribally enrolled citizens, there's less money available for those per capita payments. So it's really difficult to get a whole tribe of people, just like it would be to govern by democracy here in America, like full-scale democracy, to vote to change those, because sometimes it's not in people's self-interest, there's disagreements. Somebody's like, I don't want my per capita payment to go down, and another person's like, but our tribe is dying out. Like, we need to change our blood quantum. So all that to say, the enrolled members of federally recognized tribes are, like, in many places going down, even though demographically people that claim Native American ancestry is going up. And a lot of, like, demographically, because a lot of times when so Native peoples in general have significantly more children on average than white individuals. So like that can create so there's a lot of, like, young Native people being born all over the year. And so there's a growing, I'll say it's a growing demographic, but whether the tribe is, contracting in size or getting bigger, it really depends on what those blood quantum rules that govern you are. And you can absolutely lose rights Which is to say, the tribe itself wouldn't do this, right? But you as a citizen, sometimes you can't vote in the tribal elections if you don't live on reservation, right? So you can't choose who's going to be the tribal government if you don't live on reservation, or you can't vote in certain referenda, right? So that really does depend on your tribe, and that's one of the difficulties and beauties of doing native economic development is everything is different depending on the tribe. Right, there is no one tribe, there is no one culture, there is no one community that looks the same. I have worked with over 130 federally recognized tribes, and I can tell you each and every single one of them was different.
I think we want to thank Krystal, and this has been very, very informative. And so.
This is very fun. Thank you for having me.
And for next week, Jens Stallings, I say her last name right, who is a relatively new member. She had joined a church sometime during COVID. Anyway, she is going to present next week on how to address hate and misconceptions and whatever in our communities. And so she's already sent me her presentation, and so I think she's all ready to go. She's excited about it. She will be here next week. So let us close in prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the opportunity to learn about you and also learn about those who are around us in the communities, so that we can figure out how we can best serve you and best serve those in the world outside. In Christ's name we pray. Thank you so much. It was great. So let me just do this real quick.